The billionaire's mansion fell silent as the little girl stepped forward with her golden vial. "This will heal you," she whispered, though 188 specialists had already pronounced his death sentence. But no one imagined what would come next. Where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories that will leave you speechless. Richard Harrington stared at the MRI results on the wall, the tumor's white mass glowing like a death sentence against the black background of his brain. The specialist, the 188th doctor he'd consulted, cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington. We're looking at approximately 1 month, maybe less." Richard's fingers tightened around his Italian leather wallet. Inside was a black card with no spending limit, access to offshore accounts worth billions, and phone numbers that could reach presidents and prime ministers. None of it mattered now. "There must be something," Richard said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. At 62, the tech mogul had built an empire that spanned continents. "Money is no object." Dr. Kessler shook his head. "Sir, if there was a treatment, I'd tell you. We've exhausted every FDA-approved option, every experimental protocol, every international treatment. Your particular brain tumor is simply inoperable, aggressive, fatal." Richard finished for him. "I've heard it all before." Back in his Rolls-Royce, Richard stared through the tinted windows at Boston's skyline. The gleaming Harrington Tower dominated the landscape. 58 stories of glass and steel that would outlive its creator by centuries. He'd spent 4 decades building something permanent, only to discover how impermanent he truly was. "Where to, sir?" his driver asked. "Home," Richard replied. What else was there? The Harrington estate sprawled across 30 acres in western Massachusetts. As the car crunched up the gravel driveway, Richard spotted his personal assistant waiting on the steps, tablet in hand. Even now, with death hanging over him, there were contracts to sign, decisions to make, legacies to secure. "Cancel everything," he told her before she could speak, "and get me my lawyer." Inside, Richard poured himself a glass of 50-year-old Macallan. If ever there was a time to drink the irreplaceable, it was now. He carried the crystal tumbler to his study and sank into the leather chair behind his desk. On the wall hung awards, honorary degrees, magazine covers celebrating his ascent from college dropout to tech visionary. In the corner stood a prototype of the neural interface that had revolutionized computing and made him billions. None of it could save him now. Richard opened his laptop and typed, "Brain tumor miracle cures." He knew it was foolish, the desperate act of a desperate man. He'd already explored every legitimate medical option money could buy. All that remained were charlatans and false hope. Yet he clicked through page after page, scanning testimonials and claims. Was this what he'd been reduced to, a frightened old man chasing fairy tales? His phone rang. Thomas, his son. Richard let it go to voicemail. What would he say? That the father who'd missed his graduations, his wedding, the birth of his children, was now dying? That the empire built at the expense of family would soon need a new emperor? As night fell over the estate, Richard stood at the window, watching darkness claim the carefully manicured grounds. 1 month, 30 days, give or take. Not enough time to right the wrongs of a lifetime. Not enough time to become the man he should have been. "Sir?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Senator Preston is on the line. He says it's urgent." Richard almost declined, but William Preston was his oldest friend, perhaps his only real friend. "Put him through," Richard said, lifting the receiver. "Rich," came Preston's voice, strangely animated. "I heard about the diagnosis. Listen, there's something you need to know, something unconventional." Richard sighed. "I'm not interested in experimental treatments, Bill. I've tried them all." "Not this," Preston insisted. "This is different. It's about a little girl in Vermont." "A little girl," Richard scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Bill, I've consulted with the world's top neurologists, spent millions on experimental treatments. What could a child possibly offer?" Senator Preston's voice remained steady. "Her name is Lily Morgan. She's 7 years old and lives with her grandmother in a small town called Millfield. Rich, she's helped people before." "Helped how?" Richard couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "People with terminal diagnoses, people like you." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. William Preston had been a level-headed politician for 30 years. They'd met at Harvard before Richard dropped out to launch his first tech venture. Preston wasn't prone to fairy tales. "And how exactly does this miracle child perform these supposed healings?" Richard asked. "I don't know the details," Preston admitted, "but my aide's mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer last year. Doctors gave her weeks. She visited this girl, and now she's in complete remission. The medical team can't explain it." Richard felt the familiar flicker of hope he'd been trying to extinguish. Hope was cruel when reality offered none. "I'll have someone look into it," he said finally. "No." Preston's voice was firm. "If you want this to work, you need to go yourself. No security team, no entourage, just you." After hanging up, Richard sat motionless. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built Harrington Tech from nothing, that had predicted market trends and technological revolutions, knew this was absurd. Yet death had a way of making the absurd seem reasonable. The next morning, Richard dismissed his usual security detail and had his most discreet driver take him to his private airfield. The jet was prepped within the hour, and by noon he was landing at a small regional airport in Vermont. A rental car waited on the tarmac, not his usual luxury sedan, but a modest SUV that wouldn't attract attention. As he drove through the rolling green hills of Vermont, Richard felt strangely calm. Perhaps this was acceptance, the final stage of grief. Millfield proved to be exactly what he expected. A postcard-perfect New England town with white church steeples and maple-lined streets. Richard followed his GPS to the outskirts, where the houses grew further apart, nestled among apple orchards and woods. The Morgan home was a small farmhouse with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch. A tire swing hung from an ancient oak in the yard. Nothing about it suggested miraculous healings or last-minute salvation. As Richard parked, an elderly woman emerged onto the porch. She wore a faded floral dress and a wary expression. "Mrs. Morgan?" Richard approached, feeling oddly self-conscious in his tailored suit. "I'm Richard Harrington. Senator Preston called about me." The woman's face remained impassive. "William said you might come. He didn't mention you'd be here so soon." "Time isn't something I have in abundance," Richard said quietly. Margaret Morgan studied him for a long moment. "Most people who come here have already tried everything else. Is that true for you, Mr. Harrington?" 188 specialists, Richard confirmed. "Every treatment known to modern medicine." She nodded slowly. "Lily's resting now. She worked with another visitor this morning. Come back at sunset." She turned to go inside. "Mrs. Morgan," Richard called, a note of desperation in his voice. "What exactly does Lily do? What should I expect?" The old woman paused. "Lily doesn't do anything, Mr. Harrington. She simply helps people remember what they've forgotten, whether that will be enough for you." She shrugged. "That depends on more than just your disease." As Richard drove to the small inn in town, questions churned in his mind. Was he truly desperate enough to place his hope in the hands of a child? And what had the old woman meant about remembering? The answer, he realized as he checked into his room, was simple. Yes. When death is certain, even the slimmest chance becomes worth taking. The sun hung low in the western sky when Richard returned to the Morgan farmhouse. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the peeling paint in amber hues, momentarily disguising its shabbiness. A different woman might have seen his billions as an opportunity, might have called tabloids or tried to negotiate for money. Margaret Morgan had done none of those things, and that alone made Richard curious. He knocked on the door, and this time it opened to reveal a small figure. Lily Morgan stood barefoot in a simple blue dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. What struck Richard most were her eyes, a clear, intense blue that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her years. "You're the sick man," she said matter-of-factly. "Grandma said you'd be back." Despite himself, Richard smiled. "That's right, I'm Richard." "I know who you are," Lily replied. "Your picture is on magazines at the store. You make the computers that think like people." Richard nodded, slightly disarmed. "That's part of what my company does, yes." Margaret appeared behind her granddaughter. "Lily, why don't you show Mr. Harrington to your special place? I'll bring out some tea." The girl nodded solemnly and stepped onto the porch. "This way," she said, not waiting to see if Richard followed. She led him past the old oak tree, through a vegetable garden, and toward a small stream that marked the property's boundary. Beside it stood a crude structure, a child's fort made of fallen branches, old sheets, and twine. It looked like something from another era, a time before tablets and smartphones had replaced imagination. "This is my thinking spot," Lily explained, ducking inside. "Grandma says everyone needs a place where they can hear the quiet." Richard hesitated, then awkwardly lowered himself to his knees and crawled into the fort. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious. Cushions and blankets covered the ground, and jars of wildflowers and interesting stones lined the edges. Sunlight filtered through the fabric walls, casting everything in a soft glow. "It's very nice," Richard offered, unsure what else to say. He hadn't interacted with a child this young in decades, not since his own son was small. Lily sat cross-legged across from him. "Why did you stop believing in magic, Richard?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't think I ever believed in it," he answered honestly. "I've always preferred things I can prove, things I can understand." "That's sad," Lily said simply. "But it's not too late. That's why you're sick, you know. You forgot how to see." Before Richard could respond, Margaret arrived with a tray holding a teapot and cups. She knelt by the entrance, passing them in. "Lily's tea is special," she explained, pouring a steaming cup of amber liquid. "The herbs grow only in certain places most people walk right by without noticing." Richard accepted the cup cautiously. It smelled pleasant, like honey and wildflowers with something earthier underneath. "Is this the treatment?" he asked. Margaret smiled slightly. "No, Mr. Harrington, this is just tea." Richard sipped it tentatively. It tasted better than he expected, sweet with a complex aftertaste. "People think healing is complicated," Lily said, watching him. "That's why all those doctors couldn't help you. They're looking in the wrong places with the wrong eyes." "And you look in the right places?" Richard asked, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. "I just remember to look," Lily corrected. "Most grown-ups forget." As they drank their tea, Lily asked Richard questions no one had asked him in years. What was his favorite season? Did he ever catch fireflies as a boy? Could he remember the first time he saw the ocean? Simple questions that somehow bypassed his usual defenses. Richard found himself telling her about his childhood in Ohio, about catching frogs in the creek behind his house, about the treehouse his father had built him, memories he hadn't revisited in decades. As twilight deepened around them, Lily's expression grew serious. "You need to come back tomorrow morning, early, when the dew is still on the grass. That's when the golden light is strongest." "Golden light?" Richard asked. Lily nodded. "The medicine that will help you remember, but it only works if you're ready." "Ready for what?" "No, to see again," Lily said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Richard returned to the inn with more questions than answers. He'd spent billions building logical systems, rational networks that could be explained and replicated. Nothing about his encounter with Lily Morgan fit into those frameworks. He called Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the one physician he truly trusted. "Liz, I need you to research something for me. A child healer in Vermont named Lily Morgan." "A what?" Dr. Chen's voice crackled with skepticism. "Rich, please tell me you're not pursuing some kind of faith healer." "Just look into it," he insisted. "Medical records of people who visited her, anything you can find." "That information would be protected by HIPAA," she reminded him, "but I'll see what I can do." Richard hung up and poured himself another drink. His head throbbed, a constant reminder of the tumor pressing against his brain. The medications managed the pain, but couldn't stop the occasional tremors in his left hand or the moments of disorientation that had become more frequent. He'd built his fortune on seeing patterns others missed, on predicting what was coming before anyone else. Now he couldn't even predict whether he'd wake up lucid the next morning. His phone vibrated with a text from Thomas. "Dad, we need to talk about the company. Call me." Richard set the phone aside. There would be time for that conversation, not much, but enough. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of rural Vermont, so different from the ambient hum of Boston. When his alarm chimed at 5 a.m., Richard was already dressed. The world was still grey with pre-dawn light as he drove back to the Morgan farmhouse. Mist clung to the fields and woods, giving everything an ethereal quality. For a moment, Richard could almost believe in the possibility of magic. Lily was waiting on the porch steps, a small basket in her hands. She wore the same blue dress as yesterday, but had added a red cardigan against the morning chill. "You came," she said, smiling. "Not everyone does." "I don't have the luxury of skepticism," Richard replied. Lily nodded, as if she understood completely. "Follow me, and try to be quiet. The morning doesn't like loud noises." She led him past the fort this time, along the stream, and into the woods beyond. Richard followed carefully, his Italian leather shoes unsuited for the damp forest path. The tumor occasionally sent sparks of pain behind his eyes, but he pressed on. After about 15 minutes, they reached a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient oak tree, its massive trunk split near the base to form a hollow large enough for a person to enter. "This is the grandmother tree," Lily explained reverently. "She's been here since before the first people came." Richard didn't correct her dubious history. "What now?" "Now we wait," Lily said, sitting on a fallen log. "The sun needs to hit the dew just right." As if on cue, the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the forest canopy. They watched in silence as the clearing slowly brightened. Dewdrops on spiderwebs and leaves caught the light, transforming the ordinary forest into something spectacular. "There," Lily whispered, pointing to the hollow in the tree. "Do you see it?" Richard squinted. Inside the hollow something gleamed. He approached cautiously, bending to look inside. Water had pooled in a natural depression within the tree's hollow, but this wasn't ordinary rainwater. It shimmered with a golden hue where the sunlight struck it, as if tiny flakes of gold were suspended in the liquid. "What is it?" Richard asked, mesmerized. "The forest's tears," Lily said, joining him. "They only look like this at dawn, when the light is new. By midday they'll seem like regular water again, but they're not." She carefully dipped a small glass vial into the pool, capturing some of the golden liquid. "People forgot that the earth makes medicine," she continued. "They think only factories can do that now. But the best medicine has always been here, waiting for us to remember how to see it." She held out the vial to Richard. "This will help your body remember how to heal itself." Richard stared at the small container. In the growing daylight, the liquid inside still shimmered gold. "That's it? I just drink it?" Lily nodded. "But first you have to make a promise." "What kind of promise?" "That when you remember how to see," Lily said seriously, "you'll help others remember too." Richard hesitated. This went against everything he believed, everything his rational mind told him was possible. Yet something deeper, something beyond logic, compelled him to reach for the vial. "I promise," he said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Richard stared at the golden vial in his palm. In the strengthening daylight, the liquid seemed to pulse with an inner light, shifting between amber and gold as he turned it. "How much should I take?" he asked, unscrewing the small cap. "All of it," Lily replied. "The grandmother tree doesn't give more than you need." Richard took a deep breath and brought the vial to his lips. The liquid tasted unlike anything he'd experienced, sweet like honey, but with complex undertones of earth and herb and something indefinable. It felt warm going down his throat, spreading heat through his chest. "What now?" he asked, returning the empty vial to Lily. "Now we walk back," she said simply. "Slowly. Notice everything." As they retraced their steps through the forest, Richard was surprised to find his headache receding. The morning light filtering through the canopy seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. He found himself noticing details he'd overlooked before: the intricate patterns of lichen on tree trunks, the delicate structure of ferns unfurling, the complex symphony of birdsong overhead. "You're starting to see," Lily observed, watching him. "That's good. The medicine works faster when you help it." By the time they reached the farmhouse, Margaret was waiting with breakfast. Simple fare: scrambled eggs, toast, fresh berries. But to Richard, each bite tasted extraordinary. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten with such awareness, such appreciation. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, studying him closely. "Different," Richard admitted. "Lighter, somehow." Margaret nodded. "The first changes are subtle. You should rest today. Let the medicine work." Richard returned to his inn and slept for 14 hours straight, the deepest, most restful sleep he'd had in years. When he woke, the constant pain in his head was gone completely. His phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages, Thomas insisting they discuss succession plans, his executive board demanding decisions about the company's future, Dr. Chen with results of tests she'd run on his latest brain scans. Richard ignored them all and went for a walk. The small town of Millfield was going about its morning routine. Shopkeepers opening doors, children walking to school, elderly couples strolling the town square. Ordinary scenes that suddenly seemed extraordinary. On a whim, he entered the local diner and sat at the counter. The waitress, Darlene according to her name tag, smiled warmly. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee, please, and whatever you recommend for breakfast." She brought him blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup. As he ate, Richard found himself asking Darlene about her life, genuinely interested in her answers. She'd lived in Millfield all her life, had 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. Her husband had passed from cancer 5 years ago. "That's why I notice you visiting the Morgan place," she said, refilling his coffee. "People only go there for one reason." "Does it bother the town?" Richard asked. "Having a child healer in your midst?" Darlene shrugged. "Folks here mind their business. And besides, Maggie Morgan's family has been healing people since before this town had a name. Some things you don't question." Richard left her a $100 tip on a $12 bill. Back at the inn, he finally checked his messages. Dr. Chen had been particularly insistent, so he returned her call. "Rich," she said without preamble, "I need you to come back to Boston immediately. Something's happening with your tumor." "What do you mean?" "I mean your remote monitoring data is showing anomalies I can't explain. Either the equipment is malfunctioning or your tumor is changing." Richard touched his temple, where the pain had been constant for months. Nothing. "Changing how?" "I can't tell without proper scans. But Rich, if you're trying some alternative treatment, you need to tell me. Drug interactions could be dangerous." "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "Run whatever tests you need then." That night, Richard returned to the Morgan farmhouse for dinner. Lily had set the table with wildflowers and mismatched china. Margaret served a simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables from her garden. "The doctors want me back for tests," Richard told them. "They say something's changing with my tumor." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. The medicine works differently for everyone. For some, it takes weeks. For others. "Will it cure me?" Richard asked directly. "That depends," Lily said, her eyes serious beyond her years, "on whether you truly remember how to see." "What does that mean exactly?" Lily considered for a moment. "When I was very small, I got very sick. The doctors in the hospital couldn't help me. Grandma brought me to this house, to the grandmother tree. I drank the golden light, and it helped me remember that I wasn't just a body that could break. I was part of everything. Once I remembered that, I could heal." It wasn't a scientific explanation, but something in Richard responded to the child's words. In his ruthless climb to success, he'd severed his connections to nature, to community, even to his own family. He'd forgotten he was part of something larger than himself. As Richard prepared to leave for Boston the next morning, Lily presented him with another small vial of the golden liquid. "For when you need to remember again," she said. "But this is the last one the grandmother tree will give you. After this, you'll need to find your own way to see." The Harrington Towers private medical suite hummed with activity as Dr. Chen supervised Richard's comprehensive examination. Blood tests, neurological assessments, and finally, an advanced MRI of his brain. Richard lay still in the massive machine, listening to its rhythmic thumping. Yesterday morning, he'd taken the second vial of golden liquid, feeling that same warmth spread through his body. Whatever happened next, he was strangely at peace. When the tests were complete, Richard dressed and found Dr. Chen staring at his scans with a bewildered expression. "What is it, Liz?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I don't understand. The tumor is shrinking, not just slightly but significantly, almost 40% reduction since your last scan 3 weeks ago." "Isn't that good news?" "It's impossible news," she corrected. "This particular type of glioblastoma doesn't shrink. It doesn't respond to treatment. It grows until—" She didn't finish the sentence. "What have you been doing in Vermont, Rich?" Richard considered how to answer. "I've been remembering what it means to be alive." Dr. Chen frowned. "I'm serious. If you've found some experimental treatment, I need to know. This kind of regression is unprecedented." "I met a little girl who makes medicine from the forest," Richard said simply. "She gave me something to drink, and now I'm getting better." Liz stared at him. "You're not joking." "Run whatever tests you want on me," Richard offered. "Check for traces of known drugs or compounds. I guarantee you won't find anything recognizable." 3 days later, Richard sat in his office reviewing the comprehensive reports Dr. Chen had prepared. His blood work showed no traces of conventional medications beyond those he was prescribed. The tumor continued to shrink, now 60% smaller than its original size. His other symptoms, headaches, tremors, disorientation, had vanished completely. The medical team was baffled. Words like spontaneous remission and statistical anomaly appeared throughout their reports, scientific language straining to explain the inexplicable. Thomas burst into the office without knocking. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Liz says you're getting better." Richard studied his son, 37 years old, executive vice president of Harrington Tech, and almost a stranger. Thomas had his mother's features and Richard's drive, but there was a hardness to him that Richard recognized as his own influence. "It appears so," Richard confirmed. "The prognosis has changed." That's incredible," Thomas said, visibly struggling with his reaction. He'd been preparing for succession, for taking control of the empire. Now those plans were on hold indefinitely. "How? Does it matter?" Richard asked. "I'm not dying, Tom. Not yet, anyway." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "Well," Thomas said finally, "the board will be relieved. The stock dropped 15 points when news of your condition leaked. It was exactly the kind of thing Richard himself would have said a month ago, reducing life and death to market valuations. Now it struck him as profoundly empty. "I'm making some changes," Richard said, "personal and professional. I'd like your input if you're willing to give it." Thomas looked surprised. Richard Harrington hadn't asked for input in decades. He'd issued orders and expected them to be followed. "What kind of changes?" Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down. This might take a while." Later that week, Richard called a press conference. Rumors of his miraculous recovery had already reached the financial press, sending Harrington Tech's stock soaring. The media assembled eagerly, expecting announcements about new treatments or medical breakthroughs. Instead, Richard announced the creation of the Harrington Natural Medicine Research Foundation, with an initial endowment of $10 billion. "For too long, we've separated ourselves from the natural world," Richard told the assembled reporters. "We've forgotten ancient knowledge in our rush toward the new. This foundation will bridge that gap, bringing together traditional wisdom and modern science to create a more holistic approach to healing." Questions flew at him from all directions. "Mr. Harrington, are you saying traditional medicine cured your cancer? Will you reveal the specific treatment that led to your remission? Is this a religious conversion of some kind?" Richard raised his hand for silence. "I'm not abandoning science or technology. I'm suggesting we expand our definition of both. There are forms of knowledge we've forgotten or dismissed. It's time we remembered." As cameras flashed and reporters shouted follow-up questions, Richard felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him throughout his career. He hadn't told them about Lily or the golden liquid. Some things weren't meant to be explained, only experienced. That evening, as Richard watched the news coverage of his announcement, his secure line rang. Only a handful of people had the number. "Rich," came Senator Preston's voice, "I see you found what you needed in Vermont." "I did," Richard confirmed. "Thank you for pointing me in the right direction." "The Morgans are special people," Preston said. "They've helped many over the years. Always quietly, always on their own terms." "I've established a trust for Lily," Richard told him. "Anonymous but substantial. Enough to secure her future without changing her present." "She won't take it," Preston predicted. "Margaret has turned down similar offers before." "This one is different," Richard explained. "It's not for luxury or comforts. It's to protect the forest, especially the grandmother tree. 5,000 acres surrounding their property, preserved in perpetuity." Preston was silent for a moment. "That," he said finally, "she might accept." Richard gazed out his office window at the Boston skyline. Somewhere beyond those lights, past the highways and suburbs, ancient trees held secrets modern medicine had forgotten, and a little girl was helping people remember how to see. 1 month after his press conference, Richard sat in Dr. Chen's office, reviewing his latest results. The tumor was now barely detectable, a shadow of its former self. "I've consulted with specialists around the world," Dr. Chen said, shaking her head in disbelief. "No one has seen anything like this. We're documenting everything for the medical journals, but honestly, Rich, no one's going to believe it." "Does it matter if they believe?" Richard asked. "The results speak for themselves." "Doctor," Chen leaned forward, "it matters because there could be something in your case that helps others. If we could isolate what caused this regression—" "You won't find it in a blood test or tissue sample," Richard interrupted gently. "Some things can't be reduced to their component parts." "That doesn't sound like the Richard Harrington I've known for 15 years, she observed. "The man who believed everything could be quantified, measured, optimized." Richard smiled. "That man was dying, Liz, in more ways than one." After leaving the medical center, Richard directed his driver to take him to Cambridge. The Harrington Natural Medicine Research Foundation had leased temporary space near MIT while their permanent headquarters was under construction. The foundation's executive director, Dr. Maya Patel, waited for him in the conference room. She'd left a prestigious position at Johns Hopkins to join Richard's new venture, drawn by his vision and resources. "The applications are pouring in," she reported. "Researchers from every major institution want to partner with us, but we need to establish clearer parameters. What exactly are we looking for?" Richard considered the question. "Knowledge that's been forgotten, healing approaches that modern medicine has overlooked or dismissed, indigenous wisdom, folk remedies with genuine efficacy, the intersection of human consciousness and physical healing." "That's broad," Dr. Patel said diplomatically. "Intentionally so," Richard confirmed. "We're creating a new paradigm, not just funding incremental research." As they discussed specific proposals, Richard's attention drifted to the window. From their fifth-floor conference room, he could see the Charles River winding through Cambridge. Students lounged on the grass, enjoying the spring sunshine. Life continuing, oblivious to individual dramas of survival or transformation. His phone vibrated. A text message from Margaret Morgan. "Lily asks if you're remembering to see." Richard smiled and texted back, "Every day." That evening, Richard invited Thomas to dinner at his penthouse apartment. Their relationship remained strained, but Richard was determined to bridge the gap before it became unbridgeable. "The board is concerned about your new direction," Thomas said over appetizers. "The foundation is one thing, but your proposals for Harrington Tech are radical." "You mean the ethical AI protocols?" Richard asked. "Or the environmental sustainability mandates?" "All of it," Thomas replied bluntly. "Dad, we're a tech company, not a spiritual retreat. Shareholders expect returns, not philosophical reinvention." Richard studied his son. Thomas was trapped in the same mindset that had nearly destroyed Richard, believing that profit and purpose were separate concerns, that success could be measured solely in financial terms. "When I was diagnosed," Richard said carefully, "I realized I'd built something that would outlive me, but wouldn't carry forward anything truly important about me, just intellectual property and market position. Is that the legacy you want, Tom?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "We're not having an existential discussion about legacy. We're talking about business decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of shareholders." "We're talking about both," Richard insisted. "The two can't be separated, not anymore." Later, alone on his balcony overlooking the city, Richard contemplated the challenge ahead. Changing his own perspective had been difficult enough. Changing an entire corporate culture, and eventually, perhaps, an industry, would be exponentially harder. His phone rang. An unlisted number. "Mr. Harrington," came an unfamiliar voice. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I represent a consortium of pharmaceutical interests. We'd like to discuss your treatment." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "What exactly do you mean?" "We know about the Morgan girl," Reeves said smoothly, "and the substance that appears to have cured your glioblastoma. My clients would like to arrange a meeting to discuss acquisition and development rights." A chill ran through Richard. "I'm afraid that's not possible." "Mr. Harrington, we're prepared to offer substantial compensation, both to you and to the Morgans." "The answer is still no," Richard said firmly. "And I'd advise your clients to respect the privacy of a minor child and her grandmother." "I understand your position," Reeves replied, his tone hardening slightly. "But medical breakthroughs of this magnitude rarely remain secret for long. One way or another, this discovery will come to light." After hanging up, Richard immediately called Senator Preston. "Someone knows about Lily," he said without preamble. "Pharmaceutical interests, they're already circling." "That was inevitable," Preston sighed. "Your miraculous recovery is too public, too well documented. People are asking questions." "I need to warn Margaret," Richard said, "and I need your help to protect them." "I'll do what I can," Preston promised. "But Rich, you need to understand, once something like this gets out, it's nearly impossible to contain." The black SUVs appeared in Millfield 3 days later. They parked discreetly around town, one near the diner, one by the general store, another at the bed and breakfast. Men in suits who claimed to be pharmaceutical researchers, medical journalists, or investment consultants began asking questions about the Morgan family. Richard received the warning call from Darlene at the diner. "Those men you mentioned might come. They're here, Mr. Harrington, asking all kinds of questions about Lily and her grandmother." Richard was on his private jet within the hour, accompanied by a security team he trusted implicitly. During the flight, he called Margaret. "Don't answer the door for anyone," he instructed. "I'll be there soon." "We knew this day would come," Margaret said, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "The gift isn't meant to be hidden forever, but it needs to be protected." When Richard arrived in Millfield, he found the small town transformed. The usual tranquility had been replaced by a tense alertness. Locals eyed strangers with suspicion. Several news vans had parked in the town square. Richard's security team created a perimeter around the Morgan property, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. The story was too compelling. Billionaire tech mogul miraculously cured by a child healer in rural Vermont. It had all the elements that media and industry couldn't resist. Inside the farmhouse, Lily seemed unperturbed by the attention. She sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures of the forest, while Richard and Margaret talked in hushed tones. "You have options," Richard explained. "I can arrange for you to relocate, new identities, new home, complete security. Or you can go public on your own terms, control the narrative." Margaret shook her head. "This place is our home. The grandmother tree is here. We can't leave." "Then let me buy the surrounding property," Richard proposed. "Thousands of acres. Create a nature preserve that can't be developed or accessed without permission." "That might protect the land," Margaret acknowledged, "but it won't protect Lily from becoming a spectacle, a miracle child for the media to exploit." Richard glanced at Lily, who was now listening to their conversation. "What do you think, Lily?" "It's your gift. Your decision matters too." Lily considered for a moment, her young face serious. "The grandmother tree says it's time for more people to remember, but not all at once, and not the wrong people first." "The wrong people?" Richard asked. "People who only want to sell the golden light," Lily clarified. "It doesn't work that way. It has to be given freely, or it loses its power." Richard nodded slowly, understanding. The pharmaceutical consortium didn't want to heal. They wanted to profit. They would attempt to synthesize the compound, mass-produce it, control it. Everything the gift wasn't meant to be. "I have an idea," he said finally. "But it will require something significant from both of you." 3 days later, Richard held his second press conference. This time, Margaret and Lily stood beside him, Lily clutching her grandmother's hand tightly as cameras flashed. "I'd like to introduce you to Lily Morgan," Richard began. "A remarkable young lady who helped me see the world differently during my illness. Together with her grandmother Margaret, Lily showed me the healing power of reconnecting with nature and ancient wisdom." Reporters shouted questions about miracle cures and secret treatments, but Richard raised his hand for silence. "There is no miracle drug," he stated firmly. "No patentable compound that cured my cancer. What happened was a rediscovery of knowledge our ancestors understood, that healing comes from wholeness, from remembering our connection to the natural world and to each other." It was a careful deflection, acknowledging Lily's role while protecting the secret of the golden liquid. Richard continued, "Today, I'm announcing that Margaret and Lily Morgan will serve as honorary advisors to the Harrington Foundation. Their wisdom will help guide our research into integrative healing approaches." Additionally, we're establishing the Morgan Nature Preserve in Vermont, 5,000 acres of protected forest that will serve as a living laboratory for our work. After the press conference, pharmaceutical interest in the Morgans didn't disappear, but it diminished significantly. Without a clear product to acquire or develop, the business case weakened. That evening, at the hotel where they'd sequestered the Morgans for safety, Lily approached Richard. "You didn't tell the whole truth," she observed. "No," Richard admitted. "Some truths need to be protected. But you promised to help people remember," Lily reminded him. "How will you do that if you keep the golden light secret?" It was a question Richard had been wrestling with since his recovery. How to share the gift without corrupting it. How to help others see when seeing itself couldn't be packaged or prescribed. "I'm still figuring that out," Richard told her honestly, "but I intend to keep my promise." Summer settled over New England, bringing sweltering heat to Boston and lush growth to the forests of Vermont. The Morgan Nature Preserve took shape as Richard's legal team finalized land acquisitions surrounding the original farmhouse property. The grandmother tree and its surroundings were now protected by layers of legal safeguards and conservation easements. But while the land could be secured with money and lawyers, the secret of the golden liquid proved harder to protect. Richard's monthly checkup had become a media event despite his best efforts at privacy. Each scan showing the continued absence of his tumor fueled new speculation. Medical researchers published papers about his case, proposing theories ranging from rare genetic factors to previously unknown autoimmune responses. Dr. Chen remained frustrated by the limits Richard had placed on her investigation. "We could help so many people if you'd just let us analyze whatever it was you took in Vermont," she argued during his July appointment. "I've given you full access to my body," Richard reminded her. "Every test, every scan, every sample you've asked for. The results are there for science to study. But without knowing the catalyst, the trigger for this remission, we're just documenting an anomaly, not advancing treatment options." Richard understood her frustration. Before his transformation, he would have felt the same. Impatient with anything that couldn't be quantified, replicated, scaled. Now he recognized that some things lost their essence in that process. Meanwhile, the Harrington Natural Medicine Research Foundation was flourishing. Under Dr. Patel's leadership, they'd established partnerships with leading medical institutions and indigenous healing practitioners from 6 continents. Research projects ranged from studying the medicinal properties of rare plants to measuring the physiological effects of certain meditative states. But Richard's personal promise to Lily remained unfulfilled. How could he help others remember how to see on a meaningful scale? The answer began to take shape during a Sunday visit to his son's home in Brookline. Thomas and his wife Laura had invited Richard for dinner, a rare family gathering that reflected their slowly improving relationship. Richard sat on the patio, watching his grandchildren play in the yard. 7-year-old Emma was showing her younger brother Michael how to catch fireflies in a jar. Their delight when a tiny insect illuminated their container was pure and infectious. "Look, Grandpa," Emma called, bringing the jar to him. "They make their own light inside their bodies." Richard studied the glowing insects with newfound appreciation. "They do. It's like they're carrying stars inside them." Emma considered this with serious concentration. "Maybe everything has secret light inside. We just can't always see it." Her casual observation hit Richard like a revelation, from the mouths of children indeed. That night Richard couldn't sleep. Emma's words had crystallized something he'd been circling for months. The gift of seeing, truly seeing, wasn't about a magical liquid. The liquid had simply awakened that capacity in him, removed the barriers his adult mind had constructed. Children possessed this vision naturally. They saw the wonder in ordinary things, the connections between seemingly separate elements, the aliveness in everything. It was only through cultural conditioning and education that they learned to stop seeing, to focus only on the material and measurable. By morning, Richard had outlined a new initiative for the foundation, the Remembering Project. Its mission would be elegantly simple, to help people of all ages reconnect with their innate ability to see the world as alive, interconnected, and filled with wonder. The project would begin with schools, creating nature immersion programs, teaching mindfulness practices appropriate for different age groups, bringing elders and indigenous wisdom keepers into classrooms. For adults, there would be forest therapy retreats, sensory reawakening workshops, community healing gardens in urban areas. None of it revolutionary in isolation. The innovation would be in the scale, the integration, and the underlying philosophy that healing on every level began with remembering our place in the living world. When Richard presented the initiative to his foundation board, reactions were mixed. "This sounds more like environmental education than medical research," one board member objected. "It's both," Richard insisted. "We've created artificial distinctions between personal health, community health, and ecological health. This project bridges those divides," and Dr. Patel, initially skeptical, gradually warmed to the concept. "If we frame this as preventative medicine on multiple scales, I can see the research applications. Measuring health outcomes for participants, documenting physiological changes during nature immersion." "Exactly," Richard nodded. "But the measurements are secondary. The primary goal is the experience itself." As the meeting concluded, Richard received an urgent text from Senator Preston. "Call me immediately. Problem with the preserve." Preston's news was grim. Despite the legal protections, a logging company had somehow secured permits to harvest timber on land adjacent to the grandmother tree. Either through bureaucratic error or corruption, the permits had been approved without triggering the conservation protections Richard had established. "How soon?" Richard demanded. "They're moving equipment in tomorrow," Preston replied. "My contact in the state environmental office just tipped me off. We can file emergency injunctions, but that will take time." "I'll handle it," Richard said, already signaling his assistant to prepare the jet. When he landed in Vermont that evening, Richard found Margaret and Lily waiting in the farmhouse, a sense of tension hanging in the air. "The grandmother tree is afraid," Lily said without preamble. "She knows they're coming for her family." Dawn broke over the Morgan property with the sound of heavy machinery. From the farmhouse porch, Richard could see logging trucks and equipment assembling at the edge of the preserve, where the access road entered the forest. His legal team had worked through the night, filing emergency motions in state and federal courts, but the machinery was moving faster than the legal system. The logging company, Northeastern Timber, clearly intended to extract as much valuable hardwood as possible before any injunction could be issued. Richard's security team had established positions along the property line, but they were under strict orders not to engage physically. This would need to be resolved through other means. "We need to go to her," Lily said, appearing beside Richard in her nightgown, hair tousled from sleep. "The grandmother tree is calling." Margaret emerged from the house, carrying 3 thermoses. "I'll drive us as close as we can get. Then we walk." They took Margaret's old pickup truck down the rutted dirt road that led into the heart of the forest. When the underbrush grew too thick for the vehicle, they continued on foot, following a path only Lily seemed able to see clearly. As they approached the clearing with the grandmother tree, they heard the unmistakable sound of chainsaws in the distance. Not at the sacred tree yet, but moving in that direction, the mechanical growl at odds with the forest's natural symphony. The ancient oak stood as it had for centuries, its massive trunk glowing amber in the early morning light. But something was different. The hollow where the golden liquid pooled seemed to pulse with increased luminosity, visible even without the specific angle of dawn sunlight that usually revealed it. "She knows," Lily whispered, approaching the tree reverently. "She's gathering her strength." Margaret uncapped one of the thermoses and passed it to Lily. "Drink first," she instructed her granddaughter. "Then Richard, I'll go last." The liquid inside wasn't the pale, golden tea Richard had been served on his first visit. This was the pure, undiluted essence from the tree hollow, radiant and vibrant as liquid sunlight. Lily drank, then handed the thermos to Richard. He hesitated only briefly before taking a long swallow. The effect was immediate and profound, more intense than his previous experiences, colors sharpened to an almost painful brilliance. The sounds of the forest separated into distinct voices, each bird, insect, and rustling leaf suddenly intelligible in a language he felt rather than understood. Margaret drank last, then placed her hands on the grandmother tree's bark. "We're here," she said simply. "Tell us what to do." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Richard felt it, a vibration running through the ground beneath his feet, traveling up through his body. Not sound exactly, but something his bones could hear. Looking at Lily and Margaret, he could tell they felt it too. Lily nodded as if receiving instructions. "We need to join hands," she said, "and remember together." They formed a circle around the massive trunk, hands linked. The vibration intensified, synchronized with Richard's heartbeat. Images flooded his mind, not his own memories, but older ones, much older. He saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, before European settlement. Witnessed indigenous people gathering respectfully at this same tree, drinking from its hollow in ceremonial vessels. Watched as generations of Morgan women learned the secrets of the golden light, passing knowledge from mother to daughter. He understood suddenly that the gift had never belonged to Lily alone. She was simply the current keeper of wisdom that stretched back through time, wisdom about the profound connection between human health and the health of the land. The sound of chainsaws grew closer. Richard could sense the tree's distress as its relatives fell nearby. He squeezed Lily's small hand, trying to project reassurance he didn't fully feel. "What happens if they reach this clearing?" he asked Margaret quietly. "The grandmother tree has survived fires, blights, and storms for over 1,000 years, she replied. "But a chainsaw is different if they cut her down." Margaret shook her head. "Some things once lost cannot be recovered." As if in response to their fear, the vibration from the tree changed frequency, becoming more urgent. Lily gasped, her eyes widening. "She wants to show us something," the child whispered. "Something important." The vision that followed was unlike anything Richard had experienced. He saw the forest not as separate trees, but as a single vast organism connected through underground networks. The grandmother tree wasn't isolated. It was a hub in an intricate system that spanned miles. More surprising still was the revelation of other grandmother trees, not identical but similar in their function and age, scattered across the continent, each one a reservoir of the same golden essence, each one guarded by its own human keepers. A distributed network of healing wisdom preserved through centuries of upheaval. As the vision faded, Richard heard shouts nearby. Men with clipboards, clearly supervisors from the logging company, were approaching the clearing, marking trees with orange spray paint. They hadn't noticed the 3 people standing by the ancient oak yet, but they would soon. "I need to talk to them," Richard said, reluctantly breaking the circle. "Try to buy us some time." Margaret nodded, but Lily caught his sleeve. "Wait," she said urgently. "The grandmother tree has one more thing to show you." Richard hesitated, torn between practical action and the child's plea. Something in Lily's expression convinced him to kneel beside her again, placing his hand on the tree's bark. The final vision was the most astonishing of all. He saw himself not as he was now, but as he could be. A bridge between worlds, between ancient wisdom and modern capability, between wealth and stewardship, between forgetting and remembering. And with that vision came understanding of exactly what he needed to do. Richard strode toward the logging crew with newfound clarity. He no longer saw them as opponents, but as people equally disconnected from what mattered. Men simply doing jobs in a system designed to prioritize immediate profit over long-term well-being. "Gentlemen," he called out, "I'm Richard Harrington. This land is now protected as part of the Morgan Nature Preserve." The supervisor, a weathered man in his 50s, squinted at him. "We have permits, mister. Signed and approved last week. You can take it up with the county if you've got a problem." "I understand you're doing your job," Richard said, "but there's been a misunderstanding. Those permits were issued erroneously." He pulled out his phone and called the CEO of Northeastern Timber directly, a man he'd identified during his legal team's overnight research. "Douglas, Richard Harrington here." "Yes, that Richard Harrington. I need to discuss your operation in Millfield, Vermont." He walked a few paces away for privacy, speaking intently for several minutes. When he returned, Richard addressed the crew. "Your CEO has agreed to suspend operations pending review. You'll be receiving official notification shortly." The supervisor looked skeptical until his own phone rang. After a brief conversation, he sighed and signaled to his men, "Pack it up, we're on hold." As the logging crew retreated, Richard returned to Margaret and Lily at the grandmother tree. "That's bought us some time, but it's not a permanent solution. I had to promise to compensate the company for their contract value plus a premium." "Money solves some problems, not others," Margaret observed. "The threat will come again in another form." "Unless we change the system itself," Richard replied. The vision from the grandmother tree had shown him not just what to do, but how to do it. A comprehensive strategy that went far beyond protecting one forest or healing one man. Back at the farmhouse, Richard outlined his plan. The Harrington Foundation would expand its mission dramatically, using Richard's vast resources to identify and protect every remaining grandmother tree and its surrounding ecosystem. Not as isolated preserves, but as connected corridors of rewilded land. Simultaneously, they would establish learning centers at each location, places where people could experience the forest's healing properties without exploiting them, guided by local wisdom keepers like Margaret and Lily. "The golden liquid itself remains protected knowledge," Richard explained. "Shared only with those who approach with the right intention, at the discretion of each site's guardians." "That's a good beginning," Margaret acknowledged. "But what about the systems that threaten these places to begin with? Logging, mining, development." "That's where Harrington Tech comes in," Richard continued. "We're pivoting to focus on technologies that work with natural systems rather than extracting from them. Biomimicry, regenerative design, circular economy applications, making it more profitable to protect ecosystems than to destroy them." The plan was ambitious, perhaps impossible. But Richard had built one empire. He could build another with a different foundation. Over the following months, Richard's transformation became increasingly public. Business publications that had once celebrated his ruthless efficiency now chronicled his evolution with fascination or skepticism, depending on their perspective. Some called it a midlife crisis or the eccentricity of a man who'd faced death. Others recognized something more profound happening. Thomas remained resistant, concerned about shareholder value and market position. But as Harrington Tech's new initiatives began demonstrating financial viability, with sustainable technologies attracting premium investments and talent, his skepticism gradually softened. By Christmas, 6 grandmother tree sites had been identified across North America, from the Pacific Northwest to the Appalachians. Each was subtly different, each held by its own guardians, often indigenous elders or families like the Morgans, who had preserved traditional ecological knowledge through generations. Richard visited each location personally, not attempting to direct or control, but to listen and learn. The humility this required was perhaps his greatest challenge, setting aside the authority that had defined his identity for decades. At the Morgan farm for the winter solstice, Richard sat with Lily by the fire while Margaret prepared dinner. The child had grown noticeably in the months since his first visit, her face losing some of its baby roundness, but her eyes remained the same, wise beyond their years, seeing what others missed. "You kept your promise," Lily observed, watching the flames. "You're helping people remember." "Trying to," Richard corrected. "It's harder than I expected. The forgetting runs deep." Lily nodded solemnly. "The grandmother tree says that's why the sickness came to you, so you would understand how much the forgetting hurts and how important the remembering is." The insight gave Richard pause. Had his tumor been merely illness, or also initiation? The question itself would have seemed absurd to him a year ago. Now it felt like the most natural inquiry in the world. "Does the grandmother tree say anything about what comes next?" he asked, only half joking. "She says the hardest part is still coming," Lily replied, completely serious. "When you have to face the people who want to keep the forgetting going, the ones who are afraid of what happens when everyone remembers how to see." Richard nodded slowly. He'd already encountered resistance from pharmaceutical companies whose business models depended on treating symptoms rather than addressing causes, from extractive industries whose profits required ecological amnesia, from fellow tech leaders who viewed his transformation as betrayal of their shared values. But the grandmother tree's vision had shown him something else too, that he wasn't alone, that networks of remembering were spreading, not just through his efforts, but through countless others working in their own ways, that the time was right for a great remembering. "We'll be ready," he told Lily. "Together," he told. On a bright September morning, 1 year after his diagnosis, Richard stood before a gathering unlike any in corporate history. The auditorium at Harrington Tower had been transformed. Living walls of plants replaced conventional decor, natural light streamed through newly installed skylights, and at the center of the stage stood a sapling grown from a seed of the grandmother tree. The audience represented a remarkable convergence. Corporate executives and indigenous elders, medical researchers and traditional healers, tech innovators and environmental activists. Many had been adversaries before Richard brought them together with a vision that transcended their differences. "1 year ago," Richard began, "I was told I had 1 month to live. Today I stand before you cancer-free, but more importantly, awake in a way I hadn't been for decades." Medical scans confirming his complete remission appeared on the screens behind him, then shifted to images of the Morgan Nature Preserve and other protected sites across the continent. What healed me wasn't just a substance, though that was the catalyst. It was remembering something our ancestors knew, that human health and the health of the natural world are inseparable, that healing comes from connection, not isolation, that the solutions to our greatest challenges already exist, if we remember how to see them. Richard outlined the Harrington Remembering Initiative, a decade-long $50 billion commitment to transforming healthcare, education, technology, and environmental stewardship based on these principles. "This isn't charity," he emphasized, "it's evolution. The companies and communities that embrace this remembering will thrive. Those that cling to forgetting will become obsolete." In the front row, Thomas sat with his family. His initial resistance had gradually given way to cautious engagement, especially after his daughter Emma became passionately involved in the children's programs at the foundation. Richard caught his son's eye and received a small nod, not full endorsement yet, but openness to possibility. Beside Thomas sat Dr. Chen, whose scientific skepticism had been challenged by the undeniable results of Richard's recovery and similar outcomes now documented in others who had visited the grandmother trees with the right intention and guidance. Today, we're announcing 50 new remembering centers worldwide, Richard continued. Each one anchored by protected wilderness and supported by the latest technologies for regenerative living. Each one a place where people can relearn what they've forgotten, how to live as part of the living world, not apart from it. As he spoke, Richard felt a familiar vibration, not from the ground this time, but from within. The grandmother tree's gift had changed him at a cellular level, attuning him to rhythms and connections he'd been blind to before. Sometimes he could almost hear the voices of the trees in his own city, struggling to breathe through concrete and pollution, but still reaching out, still offering relationship. Some call what happened to me a miracle, Richard concluded. But the real miracle isn't that I survived cancer. The real miracle is that any of us survive our separation from nature, from each other, from our own deeper knowing. The real miracle is that the path back to remembering remains open if we choose to walk it. As applause filled the auditorium, Richard glanced to the side of the stage where Lily and Margaret Morgan stood watching. They had travelled to Boston for this event at his insistence, though both preferred their quiet life in Vermont. Lily gave him a small thumbs up, her approval perhaps the only validation that truly mattered to him now. The reception afterward buzzed with energy as unlikely collaborations formed among the diverse attendees. Richard moved through the crowd, connecting people who needed to meet, listening more than speaking. Dr. Patel approached with a colleague from Johns Hopkins. "We've been analyzing the data from the first Remembering Center participants," she reported excitedly. "The health outcomes are remarkable, not just for specific conditions, but across all biomarkers of aging and inflammation." "That's wonderful," Richard said, "but remember, the measurements are secondary to the experience itself, Doctor." Patel finished for him, smiling. "I know, I've begun spending time at the New Hampshire Center myself. It's changing how I think about my own research." Later, as the event wound down, Richard found a quiet moment with Lily and Margaret. "You've started something significant," Margaret acknowledged. "But remember what the grandmother tree showed you. The opposition will grow as your impact deepens." Richard nodded soberly. Already, industry groups were organizing against his initiatives. Politicians funded by extractive industries were questioning his mental stability. Former allies were distancing themselves. "The hardest part is still coming," he agreed, recalling Lily's warning from months ago. "But so is the most beautiful part," Lily added, her eyes bright with certainty. "The grandmother tree showed me that too." As Richard drove them back to their hotel, the city seemed different to his transformed perception. Not just buildings and streets, but a living system straining toward balance, full of both suffering and possibility. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a government number he didn't recognize. For a moment, Richard was tempted to ignore it, to remain in this moment of peace before the next challenge. But that wasn't the path he'd chosen. "This is Richard," he answered. "Mr. Harrington," came an official voice. "I'm calling from the office of the Surgeon General. We've been following your work with great interest, particularly the preliminary data from your remembering centers. The administration is wondering if you'd be willing to discuss a potential national initiative." Richard caught Lily's eye in the rearview mirror. She smiled knowingly. "I'd be happy to have that conversation," Richard replied. "There's someone I'd like to bring with me, if that's acceptable. A very wise consultant. She's 7 years old." As he ended the call, Richard felt the familiar warmth spreading through his chest. Not from any golden liquid this time, but from the certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he had been healed to do. The remembering had begun, and despite the challenges ahead, it would continue. one person at a time, one forest at a time, one grandmother tree at a time, until seeing clearly wasn't the exception, but the way we all moved through the world once again.